The gunshot cracked through the darkness like the sky itself had split open, and Milton Merritt threw himself behind the water trough as splinters of wood exploded past his ear. "Come out, masked rider," Sheriff Boone Halstead bellowed, his voice trembling with a fury that had been building for 3 months. "You have robbed your last stagecoach in Cedar Hollow." Milton's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of the bullets, but from what he had just witnessed with his own eyes not 10 minutes before. He had followed the notorious outlaw known only as the Masked Rider through the moonlit canyon, certain he would finally unmask the thief who had been terrorizing the mining routes between Cedar Hollow and Prescott, Arizona territory. He had cornered the rider against the rock face, pistol drawn, ready to end the chase once and for all. And then the mask had slipped. Mabel Kingsley's brown eyes had stared back at him in the moonlight, wide with the same shock that now froze Milton's blood in his veins. The schoolteacher. The woman who had taught his younger sister her letters. The woman who read poetry aloud on Sunday afternoons and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her books. "Milton," she had whispered, her voice breaking on his name, "please. You do not understand what is happening here." Now, crouched behind the trough with the sheriff's posse closing in from both sides of the street, Milton faced the most dangerous choice of his life. He could stand up, point toward the alley where Mabel had disappeared only moments ago, and hand her over to a rope that would be waiting by morning. Or he could stay silent and become a criminal himself, harboring the very outlaw the whole territory had sworn to destroy. Another shot rang out. Dust kicked up beside his boot. She went east. A voice shouted from somewhere near the saloon, and Milton's stomach dropped as he realized the posse had spotted her shadow fleeing toward the schoolhouse. He had exactly 1 moment to decide whether he loved a lie or the truth beneath it. 3 months of watching this woman teach children their alphabet by day while somehow, impossibly, robbing gold shipments by night had led to this single breath of decision. Milton Merritt rose from behind the trough, raised his own pistol toward the sky, and fired twice into the darkness. She went west, toward the canyon. He shouted, sending the posse thundering in the wrong direction, buying the woman he was falling in love with the only gift he had left to give: time. To understand how a schoolteacher became the most wanted outlaw in the Arizona territory, and how a rancher's son found himself defending her with his own life, one must go back to the spring of 1881. When Cedar Hollow was nothing more than a dusty crossroads town clinging to the promise of silver in the surrounding hills. Mabel Kingsley had arrived on the noon stagecoach in April, her trunk packed with books instead of dresses, her references from a Boston teaching academy tucked carefully into a leather satchel. She was 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and possessed of a mind so sharp that the town council had hired her within an hour of her interview, dazzled by her knowledge of mathematics, literature, and natural philosophy. What the town council did not know, and what Mabel had told no living soul in Cedar Hollow, was that her father had been a demolitions expert for the Union Army during the war, and that he had taught his only daughter everything he knew about explosives, lock mechanisms, and the delicate art of moving silently through darkness. He had also taught her to shoot a rifle with such precision that she could snuff a candle flame from 50 yards without disturbing the wax around the wick. When he died of a fever 2 years past, he left Mabel his tools, his knowledge, and a debt so crushing that the bank in her hometown had seized everything else she owned. She had come west not merely to teach, but to escape a life that had collapsed around her, and to build something entirely her own in a place where no one knew her name or her sorrows. Milton Merritt had been born in Cedar Hollow 29 years earlier, the son of a cattle rancher who had died fighting off rustlers when Milton was only 17. Since then, Milton had run the Merritt Ranch alone, growing broad-shouldered and weathered from years of branding cattle, breaking horses, and defending his land against every manner of threat the frontier could offer. He was known throughout the territory as a man of few words but absolute reliability, the sort of man other ranchers called upon when trouble arose, because Milton Merritt did not run from danger, and he did not lie. The two of them, teacher and rancher, had crossed paths often enough in the small town, exchanging polite greetings after Sunday service, nodding to one another at the general store. Milton found himself drawn to her intelligence during town meetings, the way she spoke with such clarity and conviction that even the crustiest old miners fell silent to listen. Mabel found herself intrigued by his quiet strength, the way he carried himself like a man who had nothing left to prove, having already proven it all through years of hard work. Neither of them suspected the storm that was building beneath the surface of Cedar Hollow, a storm that would soon force them both into roles neither had ever imagined playing. The trouble had begun in January, months before Mabel's arrival, when the Prescott Mining Company began shipping silver ore through Cedar Hollow on its way to the railhead in Tucson. The company's owner, a ruthless businessman named Cornelius Ashworth, had struck a deal with the local bank to finance the operation, and within weeks, half the town found itself indebted to Ashworth's schemes. Miners who refused to sell their claims at Ashworth's insultingly low prices found their water rights mysteriously revoked. Ranchers who spoke against him found their cattle turning up dead, blamed conveniently on wolves or rustlers that no one ever seemed to catch. Mabel had learned of this injustice slowly, piece by piece, from the frightened whispers of her students. Little Sarah Coltrane, only 9 years old, had come to school one morning with tears streaking her dusty cheeks, confiding that her father had lost the family homestead to Ashworth's bank the previous night. Young Tobias Reyes had stopped attending lessons altogether when his family's small silver claim was seized under a legal technicality that Mabel, with her sharp mind, recognized instantly as fraudulent. The town of Cedar Hollow was being systematically strangled, and the sheriff, Boone Halstead, either could not or would not stop it, for reasons that became clearer to Mabel with each passing week. She began to notice how Halstead's boots were always freshly polished, how his modest salary somehow afforded him a new rifle and a fine leather saddle. She began to suspect that the sheriff answered not to the law, but to Cornelius Ashworth himself. It was in June, only 2 months after her arrival, that Mabel made her decision. She could not simply teach children their letters while their families were destroyed around them. She could not stand idle while injustice consumed the very ground beneath her students' feet. And so, drawing upon every skill her father had taught her, she began to plan. Her first target had been a shipment of gold that Ashworth had extracted through fraudulent claims, gold that rightfully belonged, at least in part, to the miners he had cheated. Under cover of a moonless night, wearing a black mask her father had once used during a demolition job, Mabel Kingsley had ridden out on a horse she kept secretly stabled 3 miles from town, and she had stopped the stagecoach carrying that gold with nothing more than a well-placed stick of dynamite on the trail ahead, and a rifle aimed with lethal precision at the driver's hat, close enough to send it flying without grazing a hair on his head. The robbery had been clean, swift, and utterly without violence, though the driver would later swear to anyone who asked that the masked figure had moved like a ghost and shot like the devil himself. Mabel had distributed the stolen gold in secret, leaving small pouches on the doorsteps of families she knew Ashworth had wronged, always at night, always without a trace. It had worked. For the first time in months, hope flickered in Cedar Hollow. But hope, Mabel would soon learn, came with a terrible price. Ashworth had not taken the loss lightly. He doubled the guard on his shipments, hired gunmen from as far away as Tombstone, and pressured Sheriff Halstead to form a posse dedicated entirely to hunting down the masked rider. Rewards were posted. Wanted notices appeared on every post and storefront, describing a rider of medium build, dressed entirely in black, whose face had never been seen and whose true identity remained a complete mystery. Milton Merritt had joined the search not out of any loyalty to Ashworth, whom he despised as much as anyone in town, but because his own herd had been threatened. Ashworth's men had made it clear that any rancher who failed to assist in capturing the outlaw might find their own cattle confiscated under some new legal pretense. Milton had no choice but to ride with the posse, though his heart was never truly in the hunt. For 3 months the chase had continued, cat and mouse across the canyons and arroyos surrounding Cedar Hollow. The masked rider struck twice more, each time targeting Ashworth's shipments with the same precision and the same strange mercy, harming no one, taking only what was needed to help the families Ashworth had ruined. Milton found himself, against his better judgment, admiring the outlaw's skill even as he rode to capture them. It was on the 3rd strike, in the canyon beneath a full August moon, that Milton finally cornered his quarry, and the mask slipped away to reveal the face of Mabel Kingsley. Now, standing in the darkened street of Cedar Hollow with his pistol still smoking from the shots he had fired to mislead the posse, Milton Merritt understood that his entire world had just been irrevocably changed. He sprinted through the shadows behind the buildings, his boots kicking up dust, his mind racing faster than his feet. He knew this town better than any man alive, every alley, every gap between buildings, every place a person might hide from prying eyes. He found her exactly where he expected, crouched behind the schoolhouse in the deep shadow of its northern wall, her black mask now stuffed hastily into her satchel, her chest heaving with exertion and fear. "Milton," she gasped, pressing herself against the wooden planks as if she could disappear into them entirely. "Why did you help me? You should be dragging me before the sheriff this very moment." "Because I have spent 3 months chasing a phantom," he said quietly, kneeling beside her in the darkness, "and I find I would rather know the truth than see justice served upon someone who has only ever tried to help this town." "You do not know everything," Mabel whispered, her voice trembling now, not from fear of capture, but from the terrible vulnerability of being truly seen for the first time in years. "There are things I have done, secrets I carry, choices I have made that you cannot possibly understand." "Then make me understand," Milton said, and something in his voice, some steady warmth beneath the urgency, made her believe for one dangerous moment that she could trust him with everything. But the sound of boots on gravel nearby reminded them both that the posse's confusion would not last forever. Sheriff Halstead was no fool, and eventually he would realize the shots fired had been meant to deceive him. "We cannot stay here," Milton said, rising and pulling Mabel up by the hand, a gesture so natural between them that neither questioned it. "My ranch is 3 miles north. There is a hidden cellar beneath the barn my father built during the war, meant for storing dynamite safely away from the house. No one knows of it but me. You will be safe there until we can think clearly." Mabel hesitated only a moment, weighing the terrible risk of trusting this man against the certain death that awaited her if the posse found her first. She nodded, and together they slipped through the darkness toward the edge of town, avoiding the torches and shouts that still echoed from the canyon where Milton had misdirected the search. They reached the Merritt Ranch just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The horses lathered from the hard ride, both riders exhausted from the terror of the night. Milton led Mabel into the barn, moved aside a false panel of hay bales that concealed a trapdoor, and helped her descend into the cool darkness of the cellar below. It was there, surrounded by crates of dynamite and coiled fuse wire, that Mabel Kingsley finally told Milton Merritt the truth of everything that had brought her to this moment, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her every word. She told him of her father, the demolitions expert who had taught her everything from the chemistry of black powder to the precise angle required to fell a rock face without bringing down the mountain above it. She told him of the debts that had driven her west, of the crushing weight of watching her father's legacy seized by creditors who cared nothing for the man's service to his country. She told him of arriving in Cedar Hollow with nothing but hope, only to watch that hope curdle into horror as she witnessed Cornelius Ashworth's systematic destruction of the very families she had come to teach. "I could not simply watch," she said, her eyes fierce even in the dim lantern light. "I have skills that most women are never taught, skills my father gave me before he died. I decided I would use them, not for greed, not for glory, but because someone had to stand against what Ashworth was doing to this town." Milton listened to every word without interruption, his respect for her growing with each revelation. Here was a woman who had faced impossible odds and chosen, again and again, to fight rather than surrender. Here was a woman whose intelligence and courage put to shame every gunslinger he had ever known. "You could have simply told the town what Ashworth was doing," Milton said finally, though his tone carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "And who would have believed me?" Mabel asked, a bitter smile touching her lips. "A schoolteacher accusing the most powerful man in the territory of fraud with no proof beyond my own observations. Ashworth owns the bank records, the land deeds, even half the lawyers in Prescott. The only language he understands is loss, the same loss he has inflicted upon others." Milton considered this for a long moment, the weight of her logic settling over him like a physical thing. He had known, in some quiet corner of his heart, that Ashworth's dealings were rotten to the core. He had simply lacked the courage, or perhaps the imagination, to do anything about it beyond grumbling with other ranchers over cards at the saloon. "Show me," he said suddenly, surprising even himself with the words. "Show me what you know. Teach me what your father taught you." Mabel stared at him, startled by the request. "Why would you want such knowledge? It is dangerous, Milton. It has already made me the most wanted person in the territory." "Because I am tired of watching good people suffer while men like Ashworth grow fat on their misery," Milton said, his jaw set with the same determination that had carried him through years of running a ranch alone. "And because I think, if we work together, we might actually stand a chance of ending this properly, rather than simply robbing shipments one at a time until you are eventually caught." It was in that cellar, surrounded by the tools of her secret trade, that something shifted between them, a partnership forming that neither could have anticipated hours before. Mabel began, almost against her own caution, to explain the basic principles of the explosives her father had taught her, the careful chemistry of black powder, the precise measurements required to create controlled destruction rather than chaos. Milton proved a quick study, his practical experience with ranch work giving him an intuitive understanding of leverage and force that surprised Mabel as much as her knowledge had surprised him. Within an hour, as the sun rose fully outside the barn, they had sketched out the beginnings of a plan, one that would require both of their skills, working in perfect concert, to bring Cornelius Ashworth's schemes crashing down for good. But first, they needed proof, tangible evidence of Ashworth's fraud that could be presented to a territorial judge, someone beyond the reach of the man's corrupting influence. And to find that proof, they would need to breach the one place Ashworth kept his most guarded secrets, the safe within his private office at the Prescott Mining Company headquarters, located in the heart of Cedar Hollow itself, guarded day and night by armed men loyal only to gold. The days that followed tested both Mabel's cunning and Milton's resolve in ways neither had anticipated. Mabel could not simply return to her position as schoolteacher, not with the entire town searching for the masked rider, so she remained hidden in the cellar beneath Milton's barn, venturing out only under cover of darkness, her absence from Cedar Hollow explained by a hastily written note claiming she had traveled to Prescott to visit a sick relative. Milton, meanwhile, maintained his ranch work by day while secretly gathering information by night, listening carefully to conversations in the saloon, noting the schedules of Ashworth's guards, mapping the mining company's headquarters in his mind with the same careful attention he gave to tracking cattle across difficult terrain. It was during one of these nights, 3 days after Mabel's true identity had been nearly exposed, that Milton returned to the barn with news that changed everything. "Sheriff Halstead has doubled the reward for the masked rider," he told Mabel as she sat cross-legged on a horse blanket in the lantern light, cleaning her father's old rifle with practiced hands. $1,000, dead or alive. Ashworth is offering it personally. Mabel's hands stilled on the rifle. $1,000 is more money than most men in this territory see in 5 years of honest work. It is enough to turn even loyal friends into informants, Milton said grimly, settling onto a crate across from her. "We cannot delay much longer, Mabel. The longer you remain hidden, the more likely someone discovers you here, and then we both hang for it." The gravity of their situation settled over them both in the dim cellar light. Mabel set down the rifle and looked at Milton with an expression he had not seen from her before, something softer beneath the fierce intelligence that usually guarded her features. "You did not have to involve yourself in this," she said quietly. "You could have turned me over to the sheriff that first night and claimed the reward yourself. Instead, you have risked everything, your ranch, your reputation, perhaps even your life, to help a woman you barely know." "I know you better than you might think," Milton replied, his voice low and steady in the confined space. "I have watched you teach children with more patience than most parents manage. I have heard you speak at town meetings with more sense than every rancher and merchant combined. And now I have seen the lengths you will go to protect the people this town has failed to protect themselves. That is not nothing, Mabel. That is everything a person could hope to know about another soul." The lantern flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across the crates of dynamite that surrounded their makeshift sanctuary. Mabel felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had carried since her father's death, since the crushing weight of debts and grief had driven her to this violent, lonely path she had chosen out of desperation and conviction. "I never expected anyone to understand," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected to be caught, and I certainly never expected the man who caught me to become the one person in this territory who sees me clearly." Milton reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her own. "I see a woman who is braver than any outlaw I have ever heard tales of, and smarter than any lawyer or banker in this territory. I see a woman I have come to admire beyond anything I expected to feel for another person." The confession hung between them in the lantern light, fragile and dangerous as everything else in their lives had become. Mabel looked up at Milton, at the sincerity etched across his weathered features, and felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. "This is madness," she whispered, though she made no move to pull her hand away. "We are planning to break into Ashworth's headquarters, steal evidence that could hang us both if we are caught, and you choose this moment to speak of admiration. I have found that admiration rarely waits for convenient timing," Milton said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine humor either of them had shown in days. "Besides, if we are both to hang for this endeavor, I would rather face that fate having told you the truth than carrying regret to my grave." Mabel laughed then, a surprised, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the heavy air of the cellar. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met, or the most foolish." "Perhaps I am simply a rancher who has finally found something worth fighting for beyond cattle and fence lines," Milton replied, and the warmth in his voice made Mabel's heart ache with a longing she had not allowed herself to feel in years. They did not kiss that night, though the temptation hung heavy in the cellar air. Instead, they returned to their planning, though something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that whatever happened in the days ahead, they would face it together, as partners bound by more than mere circumstance. The plan they devised was daring in its simplicity. Ashworth kept his most damning records, the falsified land deeds, the fraudulent debt notices, the correspondence proving his collusion with Sheriff Halstead, locked within a safe in his private office. That safe, Mabel explained, was almost certainly protected by a combination lock. the kind her father had taught her to open through careful listening and patient manipulation of the tumblers. The office itself was guarded by 2 men during business hours, but at night, only a single watchman patrolled the building, making his rounds every 30 minutes with mechanical predictability. If they could time their entry precisely, using a small charge of black powder to create a diversionary explosion at the edge of town, drawing the watchman's attention away just long enough for Mabel to work the safe's combination, while Milton kept guard outside, they might obtain the evidence needed to bring Ashworth's entire criminal enterprise crashing down. It was a plan that required absolute trust between them, a trust that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect over the preceding days. As they finalized the details, checking and rechecking every timing, every contingency, Milton found himself marveling at the precision of Mabel's mind, the way she anticipated obstacles before they arose, the way she calculated risk with the same careful attention she might give to grading a student's essay. "You truly are remarkable," he told her as they reviewed the plan for the final time, the night before they intended to act. "I have known soldiers who could not plan an operation with half the precision you demonstrate without breaking a sweat. My father used to say that explosives forgive no mistakes," Mabel replied, rolling up the hand-drawn map of Ashworth's headquarters. "A single miscalculation can mean the difference between success and catastrophe. I learned early to account for every variable, every possibility, because the alternative was simply too dangerous to contemplate. And yet you chose a path filled with exactly that danger," Milton observed, watching her with an expression of undisguised admiration. "You could have simply taught your students and left the fighting to someone else." "There was no one else," Mabel said simply, and the quiet conviction in her voice told Milton everything he needed to know about the woman he had fallen for, a woman who saw injustice and refused to look away, no matter the personal cost. The night of the operation arrived cloaked in a thin veil of clouds that obscured the moon, providing exactly the darkness they needed for their desperate endeavor. Milton positioned himself near the edge of town, a small charge of black powder wired carefully to a length of fuse that Mabel had prepared with meticulous precision, designed to create noise and smoke without causing any real damage or harm to person or property. Mabel, meanwhile, made her way through the shadows toward the mining company headquarters, her black mask once again concealing her features, her father's tools of the trade tucked securely into the satchel at her hip. She moved with the same silent grace that had made the masked rider such an elusive figure for the past 3 months, slipping between buildings, avoiding the pools of lamplight that spilled from the saloon's windows. At precisely the appointed time, Milton lit the fuse and retreated to a safe distance, watching as the resulting explosion sent a plume of smoke and sparks into the night sky at the edge of town, far enough from any structures to cause damage, but loud enough to draw immediate attention. Shouts erupted from the direction of the saloon, and Milton watched with grim satisfaction as the night watchman, along with several curious townsfolk, rushed toward the commotion, exactly as Mabel had predicted. With the watchman's attention thoroughly diverted, Mabel slipped through a rear window of the mining company headquarters that she had scouted days before, her movements swift and confident despite the racing of her heart. She found Ashworth's private office exactly where the building's layout had suggested, and she knelt before the heavy iron safe with the same steady focus her father had taught her years before. Her fingers found the combination dial, and she pressed her ear against the cold metal, listening for the subtle clicks that would reveal the mechanism's secrets. It was painstaking work, each tumbler requiring careful attention, but Mabel's patience had been honed through years of practice, first under her father's watchful guidance, and later through the desperate necessity of her nighttime endeavors as the masked rider. The first tumbler clicked into place, then the second. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool night air. her concentration absolute as she worked toward the final number that would unlock Ashworth's darkest secrets. Outside, Milton kept careful watch, his heart pounding with an anxiety he had rarely felt even during the most dangerous moments of ranch work. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, and he found himself praying, in a way he had not prayed since his father's death, that Mabel would emerge safely from that building. Finally, after what felt like hours but had truly been only minutes, Mabel heard the final click and felt the safe's heavy door swing open beneath her steady hands. Inside, exactly as she had suspected, lay stacks of documents that told the true story of Cornelius Ashworth's criminal enterprise. Falsified land deeds bearing forged signatures, correspondence detailing bribes paid to Sheriff Halstead, ledgers showing the systematic manipulation of water rights and mining claims that had destroyed dozens of families throughout Cedar Hollow. Mabel gathered the most damning documents into her satchel with trembling hands, her mind racing with the enormity of what she had found. This was proof enough to end Ashworth's reign of terror once, and for all, proof that could finally bring justice to the families he had wronged. She closed the safe carefully, wiping away any trace of her presence, and slipped back through the window into the night, her heart singing with a triumph she had not allowed herself to feel in months. She found Milton waiting exactly where they had planned, his relief palpable as she emerged from the shadows, safe and successful. "You have it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper as they hurried away from the headquarters toward the safety of the surrounding darkness. "Everything we need," Mabel confirmed, patting the satchel at her hip. "Enough to hang Ashworth for fraud a dozen times over, and enough to expose Halstead's corruption alongside him." They made their way back toward the edge of town, adrenaline and triumph fueling their steps, when disaster struck with the suddenness of a summer storm. A figure stepped from the shadows of an alley, pistol raised, and Milton recognized with a sinking heart the face of one of Ashworth's hired gunmen, a man known throughout the territory as Selah's Crane. "Well, well," Crane drawled, his weapon steady despite the darkness. "Seems the masked rider has finally slipped up." And Milton Merritt, of all people, helping her along. Milton's hand moved instinctively toward his own pistol, but Crane's weapon was already trained directly on Mabel's chest, leaving no room for heroic gestures. "I would not do that," Crane warned, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. "Drop your weapon, Merritt, or I put a bullet through your lady friend's heart before you can even clear leather." Milton's blood ran cold, but he had no choice. He raised his hand slowly, his pistol still holstered, his mind racing for any possible escape from this impossible situation. "Smart man," Crane said, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of the reward he was about to claim. "Mr. Ashworth will pay handsomely for the masked rider, dead or alive, though I suspect alive will fetch a better price, considering how badly the sheriff wants to make an example of you at trial." Mabel's mind worked frantically even as fear coursed through her veins. She thought of her father, of the countless hours he had spent teaching her not just the mechanics of explosives, but the psychology of danger itself, how to remain calm when everything within her screamed to panic. "You are making a terrible mistake, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the gun pointed at her heart. "I carry within this satchel enough evidence to hang Cornelius Ashworth for a dozen crimes. If you turn me over to him, that evidence disappears, and with it, any chance you have of collecting a reward from a man who will surely silence anyone who knows too much about his affairs." Crane's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and Mabel pressed her advantage, her mind calculating the odds with the same precision she brought to disarming a lock. "But if you were to allow a safe passage," she continued, "if you were to consider the possibility that Ashworth's fall is inevitable regardless of your actions tonight, you might find yourself positioned to claim a very different kind of reward, one offered not by a criminal facing justice, but by a grateful town that finally sees the truth of what has been done to them." You expect me to believe that a schoolteacher and a rancher can bring down a man as powerful as Cornelius Ashworth? Crane scoffed, though his weapon wavered slightly, betraying his growing uncertainty. I expect you to consider the mathematics of the situation, Mabel replied coolly. Ashworth has enemies throughout this territory, families he has ruined, miners he has cheated, even lawmen he has corrupted. Once this evidence reaches a territorial judge, his empire collapses entirely. The only question is whether you wish to be remembered as the man who helped bring down a criminal empire, or the man who tried and failed to protect it. The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring, every second feeling like an hour as Crane weighed his options. Milton remained perfectly still, his hands raised, his eyes never leaving the gunman's face, watching for any sign of the decision that would determine whether they lived or died in this dark alley. Finally, Crane lowered his weapon, though his expression remained wary. "I want no part of a hanging, mine or anyone else's," he said gruffly. "But I will tell you this. Ashworth has men watching every road out of this territory. If you truly mean to bring him down, you had best move quickly before he learns his safe has been breached." "Why help us at all?" Milton asked, lowering his own hand slowly, still cautious despite Crane's apparent change of heart. Crane's expression hardened with something that might have been shame. "Because I have watched this town suffer under Ashworth's boot for 2 years now, and I am tired of being the instrument of that suffering. Perhaps this is my chance to make amends, in whatever small way I can." With that, Crane melted back into the shadows, leaving Milton and Mabel alone in the alley, both of them breathing hard from the tension of the encounter. They wasted no time debating their good fortune, instead hurrying back toward the Merritt ranch under cover of the remaining darkness, the precious evidence secure within Mabel's satchel. They arrived at the ranch just as dawn began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and rose, both exhausted but triumphant. Milton led Mabel into the farmhouse itself this time, rather than the hidden cellar, judging the immediate danger had passed for the moment. "We need to get this evidence to Prescott," Milton said, watching as Mabel spread the documents across his kitchen table, her expert eye already sorting through the papers to identify the most damning pieces. "There is a territorial judge there, Judge Whitfield, known for his incorruptibility. If anyone can act on this evidence, it is him. The journey will take 2 days by horse," Mabel calculated, "and Ashworth's men will certainly be watching the roads, especially now that Crane may have already reported our activities, despite his apparent sympathy. Then we travel by night and rest during the day," Milton said decisively. "I know trails through the hills that most travelers never use, paths my father showed me when I was a boy hunting deer in the high country. We can avoid the main roads entirely." Mabel looked up at him with an expression of gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that had been growing steadily between them since that first terrifying night when he had chosen to protect rather than expose her. "You continue to surprise me, Milton Merritt. I had thought myself entirely alone in this fight, and yet here you stand, offering not just assistance but genuine partnership." "I told you before," Milton said softly, moving closer to where she sat at his kitchen table, "I have found something worth fighting for, and I do not intend to abandon that fight, or you, regardless of the danger that lies ahead." The moment stretched between them, charged with an intimacy that had been building steadily beneath the urgency of their shared mission. Mabel set down the papers she had been sorting and looked up at Milton, her brown eyes reflecting the golden light of dawn streaming through the kitchen window. "Milton," she said quietly, "whatever happens in the days ahead, whether we succeed in bringing Ashworth to justice or whether we ourselves face capture in consequence, I want you to know that these past few days have shown me something I had forgotten was possible." "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I need not carry every burden alone," Mabel replied, her voice thick with emotion she had suppressed for far too long. "That there exists, somewhere in this harsh territory, a person capable of seeing me fully, dangers and all, and choosing to stand beside me rather than turn away. Milton reached out and gently cupped her face with his calloused hand, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her fierce composure. "You will never need to carry any burden alone again, Mabel Kingsley, not while I have breath in my body to stand beside you." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if both of them feared shattering the fragile trust that had bloomed between them amid such chaos and danger. But as Mabel's hands found their way to Milton's shoulders and his arms wrapped protectively around her waist, the kiss deepened into something fierce and certain, a declaration of love forged not in comfortable circumstance, but in shared danger and mutual respect. When they finally parted, both breathless, Milton rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I have admired many things in my life, Mabel, the strength of a good horse, the resilience of cattle surviving a hard winter, the beauty of this land I call home. But I have never admired anything so completely as I admire you, even knowing what I am." Mabel asked, though the fear in her voice had softened considerably. "Even knowing I am the most wanted outlaw in this territory." "Especially knowing that," Milton replied firmly, "because I know now what drove you to that path, and I know that no one in this territory possesses your combination of intelligence, courage, and genuine compassion for those who suffer injustice. I fell in love with the schoolteacher who taught my sister her letters, and I have fallen equally in love with the woman brave enough to fight for justice when everyone else remained silent." Their reunion was interrupted, however, by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch at a gallop. Both of them tensed, fearing discovery, but the rider who burst into the yard was not Sheriff Halstead's posse, but rather young Tobias Ray's, the boy whose family had lost their silver claim to Ashworth's fraud months before. "Miss Kingsley," the boy called out breathlessly, having apparently followed rumors of her presence at the Merritt ranch despite their careful secrecy. "You must come quickly. Sheriff Halstead has arrested my father for aiding the masked rider. He says if you do not turn yourself in by sundown, my father will hang in your place." The color drained from Mabel's face as the terrible weight of this new development settled over her. Milton's jaw clenched with fury at the injustice of it, an innocent man threatened with death simply to force her hand. "This is exactly the kind of tyranny Ashworth and Halstead have perfected," Mabel said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "They know I cannot allow an innocent man to die in my place. They are counting on my conscience to force my surrender." "We will not allow that to happen," Milton said firmly, already moving toward the door to prepare their horses. "We have the evidence needed to expose their corruption. We simply need to reach Judge Whitfield before sundown, or find another way to save Tobias's father." "There is no time to reach Prescott and return before sundown," Mabel said, her mind racing through possibilities with the same precision she brought to every challenge. "We need a different approach entirely." An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous and audacious, but perhaps their only chance to save an innocent life while still bringing Ashworth's crimes to light. "Milton, does the town still gather for the Sunday market in the square, even with all this chaos surrounding the search for me?" "Yes, the market continues. Market day is essential to the town's survival regardless of other troubles," Milton confirmed, though he looked at her with evident confusion at the seeming change of subject. "Today is Sunday," Mabel said, excitement building in her voice despite the danger of their situation. "The entire town will gather in the square, including, I would wager, Sheriff Halstead himself, eager to demonstrate his authority by presiding over whatever spectacle he plans to make of Tobias's father before executing his cruel ultimatum. What if, instead of hiding from that spectacle, we used it as our stage?" Milton's eyes widened with understanding as her plan crystallized. "You mean to reveal the evidence publicly, in front of the entire town, forcing Halstead and Ashworth to face justice before witnesses who cannot be silenced or bribed into forgetting what they have seen?" "Exactly," Mabel confirmed. It is a tremendous risk, revealing myself publicly as the masked rider. But if we time it correctly, presenting the evidence of Ashworth's fraud at the precise moment they attempt to use Tobias's father as leverage against me, the town's own outrage might protect us from immediate arrest, at least long enough to demand a fair hearing before the evidence can be dismissed or destroyed. The plan carried enormous risk, but as young Tobias watched with desperate hope in his eyes, both Milton and Mabel knew they had no better alternative. An innocent man's life hung in the balance, and the only path forward required them to gamble everything on the town's capacity for justice, once they finally understood the truth of what had been happening beneath their very noses. They rode toward Cedar Hollow, with the sun climbing steadily toward its zenith, each minute bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine not only their own fates, but the future of the entire town. Mabel had changed from her black outlaw's garb into a simple dress she kept for such emergencies, though she carried her satchel of evidence close against her body, along with her father's pistol, tucked discreetly into a hidden pocket she had sewn for exactly such purposes. As they approached the town square, they could see the crowd already gathering, drawn by rumors that had spread like wildfire through Cedar Hollow overnight. Sheriff Halstead stood upon a raised platform near the courthouse steps, Tobias's father, a weathered miner named Hector Reyes, bound and guarded beside him, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. "Citizens of Cedar Hollow," Halstead was declaring as Milton and Mabel dismounted at the edge of the square, careful to remain concealed within the growing crowd of onlookers. "This man stands accused of harboring and assisting the criminal known as the Masked Rider. Unless that outlaw surrenders themselves before the sun sets this very day, Hector Reyes will face the full penalty of the law for his crimes." The crowd murmured with unease, many of them recognizing the injustice of punishing a man for crimes he had not committed, simply to force the surrender of another. Mabel felt Milton's hand find hers, a gesture of support and solidarity as they prepared to step forward into what could very well be their final act of defiance against the corruption that had gripped their town for too long. "Now is the time," Mabel whispered, and together they pushed through the crowd toward the platform, drawing startled gasps from those who recognized them. "Sheriff Halstead," Mabel called out, her voice ringing clear and strong across the square, silencing the murmuring crowd instantly. "I am the one you seek. I am the Masked Rider." The crowd's gasp was audible, a collective intake of breath as the beloved schoolteacher of Cedar Hollow revealed herself as the notorious outlaw who had haunted their nightmares and, unbeknownst to most, protected their interests for months. Sheriff Halstead's face contorted with a mixture of triumph and confusion. "Miss Kingsley, this is absurd. You cannot possibly be the Masked Rider." "I assure you, Sheriff, I am precisely who I claim to be," Mabel replied, stepping forward with a confidence that seemed to radiate from her very bones. "But before you arrest me, and before you release this innocent man who has done nothing but suffer under your corrupt authority, I believe the good citizens of Cedar Hollow deserve to understand exactly why I chose this path, and exactly what crimes I discovered while investigating the true source of injustice in this town." With that, Mabel opened her satchel and began pulling forth the documents she had risked everything to obtain, holding them aloft for the crowd to see. "These papers prove, beyond any doubt, that Cornelius Ashworth has systematically defrauded dozens of families throughout this territory, forging land deeds, manipulating water rights, and destroying honest miners and ranchers through corrupt legal maneuvers designed solely to enrich himself at your expense." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more urgent, as Mabel began reading specific examples from the documents, naming families who had lost their homesteads, detailing the exact fraudulent mechanisms Ashworth had employed to seize their property and livelihoods. "Furthermore," Mabel continued, her voice carrying the same authority she used when commanding attention in her classroom, These documents prove that Sheriff Halstead himself has accepted bribes from Ashworth to look the other way while these crimes continued, to harass and threaten anyone who dared speak against this corruption, and to actively persecute the very people he swore an oath to protect. Halstead's face flushed with fury and panic as the crowd's attention shifted from Mabel toward him, suspicion and anger beginning to replace their earlier confusion. "These are lies," he shouted, though his voice cracked with obvious desperation. "Fabrications designed to distract from her own criminal activities." "Are they lies, Sheriff?" Milton's voice rang out now, stepping forward beside Mabel with the same unwavering confidence. "Perhaps you would care to explain, before this entire town, exactly how you afforded that new rifle you carry, or that fine leather saddle, on a lawman's modest salary." The crowd's attention turned fully now toward Halstead, and Mabel could see the moment when the tide of public opinion shifted decisively against him. Faces that had moments before regarded her with fear now looked upon her with something closer to wonder and gratitude, as the true scope of what she had risked to expose Ashworth's crimes became clear. She robbed no innocent person. Old Ezekiel Coltrane called out from the crowd, Sarah's grandfather, his weathered voice carrying the weight of long-suffered injustice. "I received a pouch of gold on my doorstep 3 months ago, exactly enough to cover the debt Ashworth's bank was demanding, at the exact moment I feared losing everything my family had built. As did my family." Another voice called out, and soon a chorus of testimonials began emerging from the crowd. Families throughout Cedar Hollow who had received anonymous assistance from the masked rider precisely when they needed it most, gold that had saved homesteads, paid off fraudulent debts, and provided medicine for sick children when Ashworth's bank had refused all mercy. Sheriff Halstead, recognizing the crowd's shifting sympathies, made a desperate move, drawing his pistol and pointing it directly at Mabel. "Regardless of your supposed good intentions, you remain a criminal, and I am authorized to arrest you on the spot." But before he could take another step, a new voice cut through the tension of the square. "Lower your weapon, Sheriff Halstead," commanded a figure who had just arrived on horseback at the edge of the crowd, flanked by 2 armed deputies wearing the insignia of territorial law enforcement rather than local authority. Milton recognized the newcomer immediately, having seen his portrait in the Prescott courthouse during previous business dealings. "Judge Whitfield," he said with evident relief. "You have arrived at precisely the right moment." Judge Whitfield, a stern-faced man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in the entire scene with practiced efficiency, dismounted and approached the platform with authoritative purpose. "I received word 3 days ago from a concerned citizen, one Silas Crane, that significant fraud was occurring in Cedar Hollow, sufficient to warrant investigation by territorial authorities. I see now that his information was not exaggerated." Crane himself emerged from the edge of the crowd, having apparently ridden to Prescott immediately after his encounter with Milton and Mabel in the alley, choosing redemption over continued service to Ashworth's corruption. "These documents," Mabel said, extending the satchel toward Judge Whitfield with steady hands, "provide comprehensive evidence of Cornelius Ashworth's fraudulent schemes, as well as Sheriff Halstead's complicity in covering up those crimes." Judge Whitfield accepted the documents and began reviewing them with the careful, methodical attention of a man who had spent decades adjudicating disputes throughout the territory. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, and when he finally looked up, his gaze fell upon Sheriff Halstead with unmistakable condemnation. "Sheriff Halstead," Judge Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you are hereby relieved of your position and placed under arrest for corruption, bribery, and dereliction of duty. As for Cornelius Ashworth, I will personally see to it that federal marshals are dispatched immediately to arrest him on charges of fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy." The crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers and disbelieving murmurs as Halstead's own deputies, recognizing the futility of resistance against territorial authority, moved to disarm and arrest their former sheriff. Hector Reyes was freed from his bonds immediately, rushing to embrace his son with tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his weathered face. Judge Whitfield turned his attention next to Mabel, his expression softening slightly as he regarded her with something approaching admiration. "As for you, Miss Kingsley, your methods have certainly been unconventional, and I cannot condone vigilante justice as a general practice. However, given the circumstances you faced, the complete absence of legitimate legal recourse available to you and this town, and the fact that your actions caused no lasting harm to any innocent person while providing crucial evidence that will finally bring genuine justice to Cedar Hollow, I am inclined toward considerable leniency in your case." "What does that mean for her, precisely?" Milton asked, unable to keep the anxiety from his voice despite the positive turn of events. "It means," Judge Whitfield said, a slight smile finally breaking through his stern countenance, "that given the overwhelming evidence of Ashworth's crimes and the testimony of numerous citizens regarding the benevolent nature of the masked rider's activities, I am prepared to grant Miss Kingsley a full pardon for her actions, provided she agrees to cease such activities now that legitimate justice has finally arrived in this territory." The crowd's cheers grew even louder at this pronouncement, and Mabel felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her own face as the terrible weight of months of secret danger finally lifted from her shoulders. Milton pulled her into an embrace right there in the town square, uncaring of who might witness this display of affection between the schoolteacher and the rancher. "You did it," he whispered against her hair. "You brought justice to this entire town, and you saved an innocent man's life in the process." "We did it," Mabel corrected, pulling back slightly to look into his eyes. "I could never have accomplished any of this without your help, Milton. Your courage, your trust, your willingness to stand beside me even when every reasonable instinct might have told you to turn away." In the weeks that followed, federal marshals arrived to arrest Cornelius Ashworth, who was discovered attempting to flee the territory with what remained of his ill-gotten fortune. He was tried and convicted of numerous counts of fraud and forgery, sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, his vast criminal empire dismantled piece by piece as investigators uncovered the full extent of his corruption throughout the region. The families he had wronged began the slow process of reclaiming their stolen land and livelihoods, with Judge Whitfield personally overseeing the restoration of fraudulent claims and the return of properties seized through illegal means. Hector Reyes's family received back their silver claim, along with damages that would ensure young Tobias could continue his education without fear of poverty. Sheriff Halstead faced his own trial for corruption, ultimately sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for his role in enabling Ashworth's schemes and persecuting innocent citizens on the wealthy criminal's behalf. Cedar Hollow, freed from the shadow of tyranny that had gripped it for nearly 2 years, began to flourish once more, its citizens grateful beyond measure for the schoolteacher whose secret courage had ultimately saved them all. Mabel returned to her position at the schoolhouse, though she was no longer forced to hide her true identity or her past actions as the masked rider. The town, rather than condemning her for her vigilante activities, embraced her as something akin to a local hero, a woman whose intelligence and bravery had accomplished what months of official investigation had failed to achieve. Milton, meanwhile, found his own reputation enhanced throughout the territory, known now not merely as a reliable rancher, but as the man whose steady courage and unwavering loyalty had helped bring down one of the most corrupt criminal enterprises the region had ever witnessed. Ranchers and merchants alike sought his counsel on matters both practical and moral, his standing in the community elevated by his role in exposing Ashworth's crimes. But amid all this public acclaim and vindication, it was the private moments between Milton and Mabel that mattered most to both of them, moments of quiet intimacy that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger, and had blossomed into something far deeper and more permanent than either had initially dared to hope. Autumn arrived in Cedar Hollow with its characteristic beauty, golden leaves drifting across the town square where, months before, Mabel had revealed her secret identity before the entire community. It was on a crisp October evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills in a blaze of orange and purple, that Milton led Mabel to that very same square, now decorated with lanterns for the town's annual harvest celebration. "Do you remember," Milton said, taking both her hands in his as they stood beneath the same platform where justice had finally been served, "when you told me that you had spent your entire life carrying every burden alone, believing no one could truly see you for who you really are?" "I remember," Mabel said softly, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun and the lanterns beginning to flicker to life around the square. "I have thought often, these past months, about how remarkable it is that a man chasing an outlaw through a moonlit canyon should discover, in that unmasking, not a criminal to fear, but a woman to love beyond all reason," Milton continued, his voice thick with emotion as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that he had commissioned from the jeweler in Prescott weeks before. "Mabel Kingsley, you are the most intelligent, courageous, and remarkable woman I have ever known. You have shown me that true strength lies not merely in physical capability, but in the willingness to fight for justice, even when the entire world seems arranged against you." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring, elegant in its understated beauty, exactly matching the quiet dignity that Mabel had displayed throughout their entire ordeal together. "I love you," Milton said, kneeling now before her in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the warm glow of harvest lanterns and the distant sounds of the town's celebration. "I love your mind, sharp enough to outwit criminals and corrupt lawmen alike. I love your courage, strong enough to face impossible odds without flinching. And I love your heart, generous enough to risk everything for people you barely knew, simply because you could not bear to witness injustice without acting against it. Will you marry me, Mabel Kingsley, and allow me the honor of standing beside you for the rest of our lives, whatever challenges we might face together?" Tears streamed freely down Mabel's face now, tears of joy that mixed with the profound relief of finally finding a place where she belonged completely, a person who saw and loved every aspect of who she truly was, both the beloved schoolteacher and the fierce protector who had once haunted the dreams of corrupt men throughout the territory. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness as Milton rose to slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Milton Merritt, I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that a rancher's courage matched an outlaw's desperation on that terrible, wonderful night when everything changed between us." Their kiss beneath the harvest lanterns drew applause and cheers from townsfolk who had gathered for the celebration, many of them witnesses to the very confrontation that had first exposed Mabel's secret identity months before. Now, rather than fear or condemnation, the town offered only joy and celebration for the union of two people whose courage had saved them all from tyranny. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony held in the very schoolhouse where Mabel had taught countless children their letters, surrounded by the families whose lives had been transformed by her secret courage and Milton's steadfast support. Judge Whitfield himself traveled from Prescott to attend the ceremony, along with numerous citizens who had benefited from the masked rider's mysterious generosity during those dark months of Ashworth's tyranny. Hector Reyes, now restored to prosperity through the return of his family's silver claim, stood as a witness to the ceremony, his son Tobias serving as ring-bearer, a small but significant gesture acknowledging the family's gratitude toward the woman whose bravery had saved his father's life. Even Silas Crane attended, having found honest work as a deputy under the new sheriff appointed by Judge Whitfield, his path toward redemption complete through his choice to abandon Ashworth's corruption in favor of genuine justice. Sarah Coltrane, now 10 years old, presented Mabel with a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered herself from the hills surrounding Cedar Hollow, flowers not unlike those Mabel had once pressed between the pages of her books during quieter, less dangerous days. As Milton and Mabel exchanged their vows before the assembled community, both of them understood the profound journey that had brought them to this moment. From that terrifying confrontation in the moonlit canyon, through the desperate days of hiding and planning, through the dangerous confrontation with Crane in the darkened alley, and finally to the triumphant revelation before the entire town, their love had been tested and proven in circumstances that few couples ever faced. "I take you, Milton Merritt," Mabel said, her voice steady and clear as she spoke her vows, "not merely as my husband, but as my truest partner in all things, the man who saw beyond my mask to the woman beneath, and who chose to stand beside me rather than turn away from the danger and complexity of who I truly am." "I take you, Mabel Kingsley," Milton replied, his own voice thick with emotion as he gazed into the eyes of the woman who had transformed his understanding of courage and love alike. "Not merely as my wife, but as the partner who taught me that true strength encompasses both fierce independence and profound love, that a person can be simultaneously gentle enough to teach children their letters and formidable enough to bring down criminal empires. I promise to stand beside you always, in whatever challenges the future might bring." Their marriage was blessed within the first year with a son, whom they named Nathaniel after Milton's father, a boy who grew up hearing stories of his mother's secret courage and his father's steadfast loyalty, tales that would become local legend throughout the territory for generations to come. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Grace, named for the mercy and compassion that had guided Mabel's actions even during her most dangerous exploits as the masked rider. The Merritt Ranch flourished under their combined stewardship, Milton's practical expertise in cattle and land management complemented perfectly by Mabel's sharp business acumen and strategic thinking, skills that had once been employed in planning daring robberies, now redirected toward building a prosperous and honest enterprise. Mabel continued teaching at the Cedar Hollow schoolhouse for several more years, eventually training a new generation of teachers to carry forward her legacy of education and compassion throughout the growing territory. Cedar Hollow itself transformed in the years following Ashworth's downfall, evolving from a town gripped by fear and corruption into a thriving community built upon the principles of justice and mutual support that Mabel and Milton had fought so hard to establish. New settlers arrived, drawn by tales of the town's remarkable history and its reputation for fairness, and the population grew steadily as the territory itself moved inexorably toward eventual statehood. Milton often reflected, during quiet evenings on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the golden light of sunset, on how dramatically his life had changed since that fateful night when he had cornered an outlaw in a moonlit canyon, only to discover the woman who would become his greatest love and most cherished partner. He had learned, through Mabel's example, that true courage required not merely physical bravery, but the wisdom to recognize injustice and the determination to fight against it, regardless of personal risk. Mabel, for her part, often thought back to those desperate months when she had believed herself entirely alone in her fight against Ashworth's tyranny, never imagining that a rancher's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty would provide the partnership she needed to finally succeed in her dangerous mission. She had learned that true partnership meant not merely sharing burdens, but finding someone capable of seeing her complete self, both the gentle schoolteacher and the fierce protector, and loving her entirely for the complexity of who she truly was. Years later, when their children grew old enough to understand the full story of their parents' courage, Mabel would sometimes retrieve her father's old rifle from its place of honor above the fireplace, demonstrating for Nathaniel and Grace the same precise skills he had taught her decades before. She never regretted the dangerous path she had chosen during those turbulent months, understanding that sometimes justice required extraordinary measures, and that her willingness to fight against tyranny had ultimately led her to the greatest happiness she could have imagined. Milton, meanwhile, continued to marvel at his wife's remarkable capabilities throughout their long marriage, watching with pride as she solved problems that stymied other members of the community. Whether calculating the precise angle needed to blast a new well on a neighboring ranch, or negotiating fair terms for local miners still recovering from Ashworth's fraudulent schemes. He never forgot that shocking, transformative moment when her mask had slipped away in the moonlight, revealing not merely a beautiful face, but an intelligence and courage that would forever change the course of his life. Their love story became legend throughout the territory, told and retold in saloons and parlors alike. The tale of the schoolteacher who had secretly protected her town as a masked outlaw, and the rancher whose courage and loyalty had helped her bring justice to a community gripped by corruption. Some versions of the story exaggerated certain details, transforming their careful planning into wild adventures of gunfights and daring escapes, but the essential truth remained constant across every retelling: that Mabel Kingsley and Milton Merritt had found in each other a love strong enough to overcome any danger, any secret, any challenge that fate might place before them. As they grew old together on the Merritt Ranch, watching their children grow into adults and eventually welcoming grandchildren into their expanding family, Milton and Mabel would often sit together on their porch in the evening, watching the sun set behind the same hills where their extraordinary love story had first begun. They had built a life together founded upon mutual respect, genuine partnership, and a shared commitment to justice that had never wavered despite the passing decades. "Do you ever regret it?" Milton asked one evening, many years after their adventure, as they watched their grandchildren playing in the yard below the porch. "The danger, the risk, everything you endured during those months as the masked rider." Mabel considered the question carefully, her mind traveling back through the years to that terrifying, transformative period when her secret identity had first been discovered by the man who would become her husband. "I regret nothing," she said finally, taking Milton's weathered hand in her own. "Every risk, every danger, every terrifying moment led me precisely to this life, this family, this love that I could never have imagined possible when I first arrived in Cedar Hollow with nothing but grief and determination in my heart." "And if you could change anything about that time," Milton pressed gently, "would you have avoided the danger entirely, chosen a safer path?" "Never," Mabel said firmly, her eyes reflecting the same fierce conviction that had guided her through those dangerous months so many years before. "Because that danger, that terrible risk, revealed to me not only my own strength and capability, but also the depth of character possessed by the man who chose to stand beside me rather than turn away. I would face every terror again gladly, if it meant finding my way to you, Milton Merritt, and to this beautiful life we have built together." Their love, forged in danger and tempered by years of genuine partnership, remained as strong and vibrant in their later years as it had been during those first passionate days when a masked outlaw and a determined rancher had discovered that true love requires not merely attraction, but profound respect for the complete complexity of another person's character. Cedar Hollow remembered them both as heroes, but more importantly, they remembered each other as the truest partners either had ever known, bound together by courage, intelligence, and a love that had proven strong enough to overcome any darkness the world might present. And so, in the golden years of their lives, surrounded by children and grandchildren, respected throughout the territory for the justice they had helped bring to Cedar Hollow, Milton Merritt and Mabel Kingsley continued to embody the truth they had discovered together during those dangerous, transformative months so long ago. That the greatest love stories are not those free from challenge or danger, but those strengthened by the courage to face such challenges together, hand in hand, hearts fully open to whatever truth the other person might reveal. Their story stood as testament throughout the territory to the power of seeing beyond masks and appearances to recognize the true character beneath, and to the profound love that could bloom when two people found in each other not merely romantic attraction, but genuine partnership built upon mutual respect, shared courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice that had defined both their individual characters long before fate brought them together on that fateful, moonlit night in the canyon outside Cedar Hollow.